Hey there, extra historians. Welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you all the things we left out, the stuff we got wrong, and whether it's really possible to drown someone in a vat of wine. I'm Rob, I'm the head writer of Extra History, and we're talking about Wu Zetian this time. This was a fun series. Thank you to our patrons for choosing it. If you'd like to help shape the future of our show, you could head over onto Patreon, and there are different tier levels that you could suggest topics or vote on topics. We're also part of the Nebula First program, so if you want to see these episodes a week in advance, head over to Nebula. You also get them ad-free. Recommended reading for this week is Wu, the Chinese Empress Who Schemed, Seduced, and Murdered Her Way to Becoming a Living God by Jonathan Clemens. This is an okay book for the basics. It's good to broaden your search out into other books in this series. Empress Wu Zetian in Fiction and History, Female Defiance in Confucian China by Dora Xiu-Fang-Dian is a really great supplement to that. There's also a lot of academic articles that we'll link down in the description. There aren't that many books about her in English, so the pickings are a little slim. Just a few general shout-outs. First, I want to talk about that we've had a new team member on this series, Alexandra Ciso. She's my new research assistant. Basically, my role as head writer had expanded a lot the last 6 years, and I was spending a lot of time doing things that were not writing in the episodes. And this helps me refocus some of my effort onto that. She's fantastic. She's a PhD candidate, and I'm really looking forward to showing you the things that we've done together in the next few series. Let's just start off with a patron question from John Cox, starting off by saying that the history was written by people who didn't like her. Interesting. Yeah, it's really important to remember that these dynastic histories are written for a really specific audience, basically future Confucian court officials and emperors. They're not for the general public, and they are not objective. And so we have to do a little bit of work interpreting and reading between the lines and comparing what they're saying about Wu to how the Tang was doing at the time, which was well. I mean, it was at its greatest territorial extent. There was major innovations in culture and religion, and during her 40-year reign, the empire kind of flourished, despite all this crazy stuff that's happening at the top. And you could even argue because of some of this crazy stuff that was happening at the top. I mean, Confucian ethics kind of set the emperor aside from normal people. The idea is that if the emperor is doing something, you've heard if the president does it, it's not illegal. If the emperor was doing something with the good of the empire and the keeping together the dynasty as his, or in this case, her goal, that was just fine. You could do basically anything. Morality was essentially waived, provided you were doing it for the good of the empire. So, you know, Wu does a lot of stuff that people just wouldn't think that badly if male emperors did it. And it is looked at a little differently because she's a woman. But you always have to interpret this bias. This is a normal thing that historians do, especially at this time period, right? You wouldn't take a hagiographic life of a saint from the Byzantine Empire at this time and read it uncritically, right? You would look for, well, how have they taken what really happened and kind of put a spin on it to get the meaning that they want. Just a normal part of the historian's job. Patron question from Aaron Newman. One thing about Chinese history is that 99.95% of it is written by the followers of Confucius. So if you piss them off, you'll get written about extremely horribly. Yep, just hammering home that point. We had a wonderful comment about the first episode. It's worth mentioning that the relationship between Wu and Gaozong is usually considered immoral in China, but this isn't necessarily the case. The rulers of the Tang dynasty were once part of the so-called Guanlong group. They'd been married into the Yanbei nobles for a long time, and in that culture, it was a pretty normal thing that you could inherit your father's wife as long as she was your stepmother, that she wasn't your biological mother. So this relationship may have just been a typical example of this custom. I think this is a really interesting thing, but I think it's crucial to understand that other figures at court would not have been part of this. And So it might have been fine inside the family, but a lot of people. I mean, the Tang was doing things quite differently than they had been done previously, and there was a lot of ill feeling about that. And this may have just been one more thing, right? I want to throw a little cold water on the story about her taming of the horse, or suggestion of taming the horse. So if you remember, she says that I can tame this untamable horse, just give me an iron whip, an iron mace, sometimes it's translated as hammer, and an iron dagger. I will whip it. If it does not submit, I will hit it with the mace. If it does not submit, I will cut its throat. She tells this story herself when she is on the throne, and she's saying it to a court official. So on one hand, you could say, oh, she's reminded of this story from her past when she's the concubine of Taizong, and I would say that she's using this as an allegory for how she will treat officials that are not doing what she wants them to do. And you can interpret that as like this is a story she made up for the purposes of this, or one that did happen, but she was kind of using it in this as a metaphor at this point to try and get this guy to behave. You could go either way. It's basically the only story we have about this period of her life, though, so I wanted to include it. Episode 2, YouTube question. Something I learned was that China doesn't really have the concept of a witch. I think you should dig deeper into that source you were quoting and how it was translated. Taoist magic is very much a thing, but yeah, you don't have this like Western conception of a witch in Chinese culture. Here's why I used witch rather than another translation. I had kind of two options. I'd seen this quote as witch, let those witches can get drugged to their bones, and I had seen it as a word that rhymes with witch, but starts with a B. We try and avoid profanity in our shows, so I went with that one. It does create, it doesn't quite fit culturally, though. You were absolutely correct. But that's the reason I went with witch rather than something else. And I didn't want to change the quote. I thought I'd get myself in trouble there if I maybe used a word that had a different context or wasn't the proper one. Everyone wanted to know about the two older brothers and what happened with them. These are the Gaozong's older brothers. That might be one-off material, but the one thing I do want to talk about, I think is just hilarious, is, they're fighting all these horse nomads, basically, at this time, and one of the sons just decides horse nomads are super cool, and he decides to have like sort of these Ren Fair SCA reenactments, where he and his buddies all dress as them, and they're like sleeping in tents in a courtyard in the palace, and it's really weird, and I love this whole aspect. Like I said, maybe a one-off in the future. I just think it's really funny. The story about having all their arms and legs cut off and being thrown into a vat of wine to drown is almost certainly an invention. It seems very impractical. Also, it's similar to a story that was already existing about another empress that is even more disgusting, that involves her having a favorite concubine like mutilated so that she resembles a pig and is thrown in a pigsty, and she invites the emperor to see this wonderful new pig that she's gotten, and it's his favorite consort who's been like horribly mutilated and is trying to get out and get away from this pigsty on like her bloody stumps. It's really gross. But yeah, that probably inspired this, and it was just inserted. I mean, she almost certainly killed them, but not like that. Episode 3, patron question from Purian. We got bloody ghosts in this episode, but riots? Yeah, the riots were in the next episode. It got moved, and then the title didn't get changed. Sorry about that. YouTube question. Isn't Wu one of the women that were dragged into the mythos surrounding Tomama no Mai? This is the short answer is no, as far as I know. This is a story from the Edo period in Japan, and it's about a nine-tailed fox spirit, a kitsune spirit that is possessing various women throughout history. It's like 2,000 years worth of timeline of the spirit possessing different women. And essentially any time there was a story in history, whether it was from China or Japan or even India, about a ruler being unusually attached to a concubine or an empress and then getting sick and dying. The idea was like that was the spirit, and eventually was like possessed in a stone, and then the stone was exorcised. And this is the stone, by the way, that broke open in 2022, if you saw that. So it's an interesting story. I haven't seen Wu connected to it. In my opinion, this is more related to Taoist beliefs about sex, where the internal reserve of spiritual energy, the key of the man, is sort of depleted and given to women during sex, which was a Taoist belief. There are actually weird manuals about how to prevent that from happening in various ways. But I'm sorry, I'm being a little oblique about this. But I think it's more related to that, and particularly like very emotional connections and monogamous sex was considered to be particularly depletionary. And this is one of the reasons that it was considered more healthy for emperors to kind of like spread it around the harem, if you know what I mean. So I think they probably had what was a fairly healthy relation, what we would think of as a fairly healthy monogamous relationship, and it was cast as making him ill. That's the theory that I find the most convincing that I've read. Someone said, I didn't know Wu and Gaozong moved the capital back to Luoyang. I wonder how often China's capital has been moved. Well, traditionally, there are 4 great ancient capitals of China. There's Beijing, Xi'an, Luoyang, and Nanjing. But, I mean, if you count, it depends on like what you consider quote unquote China, right? Because there's many large kingdoms that have been in China, but might not be all of what is historically China now. There's like southern dynasties and northern dynasties and the Three Kingdoms period. But often you can count up to like 25 or 30, but really the answer is 4. But where is the capital and what is the capital is kind of a fun thing to wonder about. Technically, Washington, D.C. is the 9th capital of the United States. But some of those were like York, Pennsylvania for half a day during the Revolution, right? And because the Congress met there. It depends on your definitions, but really 4. Someone said, if you're talking about Wu, don't forget to mention her famous frenemy, Judge D. So Judge D, the Detective D or Judge D character we know today, is based on an official at the time, in Wu's time, who served with her and was very popular with her, but like any official at this time kind of had his ups and downs and ins and outs. Some stories were written about him in 1890 in Chinese that are more like mystery stories, using him as a character, and these were translated into English in 1947 by a Dutch sinologist who went on to write kind of traditional Western detective gumshoe novels about Dee. These then got translated back into Chinese in the 1980s, and people loved them, so they started making Detective Dee television shows and movies. And what's neat about this is this Dutch author had created a very kind of ahistorical, like Orientalist view of Dee. But all this media that was made about him in China resituated him with Wu in the historical period where the man who inspired it actually lived. And that has kind of like become, like he's now this beloved character. I have to say that that 1947 book, not the novels later, is absolutely excellent. You should definitely read Celebrated Cases of Judge Dee, Di Gungan, if you can. It's a lot of fun. It's the only book I've ever been assigned in a class that I read it in a single sitting because I was enjoying myself so much. Episode 4, Patron Question by Marina de Morris. Isn't there a tale that says the large Vairocana Buddha statue at the Fengshan Temple's face is supposedly shaped after Wu Zetian? Yes, I don't know how much I trust that, but the face is unusual. And if it's true, it'd be the only contemporary image we have of her. I didn't necessarily, there was something, I just had like a little tickle in my stomach about it that I wasn't sure about, so I didn't put it in the show, but it's great to mention here. YouTube question. In the beginning of the video, the narrator says 17th century instead of 7th century. Yeah, we had, I think at one point we accidentally used an old audio that should have had corrections on it for one episode, and then there was one that slipped by here in episode 4. So sorry about that. Episode 5, YouTube question. One mistake. Wu didn't kill her secretary, Shengguan Wan'er. Shengguan Wan'er outlived Wu and became important to the second reign of Gaozong, but was killed in 710 by the future Emperor Xuan. Yes, this was my mistake. I should have said she was sentenced to death rather than executed. She was sentenced to death, but then Wu decided to spare her and tattooed her face instead. Sometimes these errors happen when condensing the story, especially when I list, like, these are the people she killed, and then I end up accidentally adding in one that was only sentenced to death. And yeah, sorry about that. There was a long review of the series as a whole, and I thought it was really interesting and good to read, but it was someone who had watched Nebula. I will say that your ongoing Wu Zetian series, which just wrapped up, suffers a fair bit from the trope of dealing with female rulers solely in terms of private life or palace intrigue, and hardly ever focusing on policy. The only substantial bits about that are just glossed over quick in the latest video, and it's a bit disappointing to keep hearing female rulers described entirely in private terms. Now, in fairness, this could apply to your early works, i.e. the Suleiman series didn't deal much with it, but it still seemed a bit wrong to me. Anyway, I just wanted to share it. It's a great comment. Thank you very much. That is something you have to, that is absolutely something that happens a lot. I would say part of that is because we do tend to focus on kind of the personality a lot. And that's because we're a narrative history show, and we're trying to like bring people along in kind of like a narrative of a journey. But I think this is especially true with Wu because so many of the records really focus on her private life and the palace intrigue aspects. This is a huge part of it. But we did talk about her kind of changing religion and roles of women in religion and the examination system and the war, but we didn't get too into the war. But again, she's not physically present for it. So we don't get a lot of that in the records of her life. But for this series, I would really say that the personal is political. I mean, it's a lot about succession. It's a lot about who's in, who's out at court. Her dealings with officials, like that's running the empire. That's like the meat and potatoes of running the empire in this period, is having these personal relationships and heading off plots and possibly entangling rivals in plots. Everyone is doing this, not just Wu. I mean, the officials are going after each other all the time as well. So I think that's a great thing to keep in mind. Thank you very much. Great comment. I do think that like you do have to specifically focus on her private life in this particular instance. But we did cut out a lot about like gift giving and who's invited to what dinner, and like a lot of that stuff really matters a lot in this period. Coming up on Extra History, Sitting Bull. This was a great series to work on. After that, Secret Societies, which is a series of one-offs on things like the Bavarian Illuminati or the Knights of the Golden Circle. Hypatia of Alexandria, which is a cool kind of early science series about a woman who was horribly brutally murdered, but was one of the scientific luminaries of her time. And we are currently voting on topics for the American Revolution. Now, normally this is where we would do Ibn Battuta's side trip, but we're actually premiering a new little segment here that I like to call Context Farie's World Tour. This is when we step back and see what else is going on in the world at the time of Wu's reign. So, over in Western Europe, the Kingdom of Northumbria is the most powerful kingdom in Britain, but Mercia is right about poised to start eclipsing it. This is kind of the quote-unquote Arthurian era. In 200 years after, right, Alfred the Great will begin his campaign to unite the kingdoms that will eventually be kind of the project we now know as England. So quite a bit far back there. In 680, Hussein bin Ali, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, is killed at the Battle of Karbala. This splits the Muslim community. And down in Southeast Asia, the kingdom of Srivijaya, which you can learn more about in our Majapahit series, dominates Indonesia with its center base on Sumatra and its fleets controlling the lucrative spice trade. In 695, a combination of religious disunity, new land policies, and imperial spending triggers an uprising in the Byzantine Empire that dethrones Justinian II, and he gets his nose cut off. And don't worry, he'll be back with a new golden nose. But that's a story for another time. For now, thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.
The biggest beam thanks to Ahmed Ziad Turk, Angelo Valenciana, Arclight Games, Dominic Valenciana, Izzy Coin, Joseph Blame, Kuya Koi, and Michael Hoggett for being our legendary patrons.